Vrindavana Ganesh working on my book by Krishna's here. He'll be here for another maybe 6 weeks or so. And he's doing lots of service. Chidahari's here almost every day also. We're trying to take the Audarya, it's a beautiful place, but it was never finished in terms of my vision. Whether it ever will be in terms of my vision, I'm not sure. But we're along with the publishing, moving in that direction. So it's nice.
Okay, well, we have 5 questions today so far.
Okay.
Maybe some more that pop up in the chat. So the first question is from Eric, who's sitting at the airport, ready to take off soon. So we're going to let him go first.
Okay.
Nandavat pranams. Good morning, Maharaj. Nice to see you.
Morning.
So my question is regarding some statements from previous acharyas regarding the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So I've often heard that one shouldn't read the 10th canto without having first read all of the earlier ones. So for this reason, I've tended to err on the side of caution from reading anything concerning topics within the 10th canto. However, I've also heard that other books, such as Srila Prabhupada's Krishna book, are okay for people to read in general, since he's sort of interwoven commentary throughout it. So I guess I just wanted to clarify, is it permissible for someone like myself who hasn't read all the cantos up to the 10th to read these sorts of literatures or similar narratives and translations of 10th canto pastimes, as long as they're narrated by acharyas within Gaudiya lineage? I guess I was thinking of this question when I was reading your book, Aesthetic Vedanta, and I got to the second section and I didn't know if I could proceed further, if it was okay for me to do so. But
it's okay, yeah. Yes, reading the Bhagavatam is important. It's one of 5 angas here in the Bhagavatam, mentioned by Rupa Goswami and underscored by Rupa Goswami in his section in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where he delineates the various angas of Vaidhi Bhakti, most all of which are also incorporated into the practice of Rag Bhakti. So Sadhu Sangha, Nam Kirtan, Bhagavat Shravan. So Sadhu Sangha, Nam Kirtan, Bhagavat Shravan, hearing the Bhagavatam. Then he also includes living in Mathura, a holy place, and worship of the deity. These 5 angas of bhakti are very powerful. And with regard to your question, hearing the Bhagavatam, in the commentaries on Rupa Goswami's verse, I believe Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur echoes Jiva Goswami, the original commentator, who says this means the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam. So they don't, the earlier and founding acharyas of the Sampradaya don't give that kind of a caution that you have to read the first 9 cantos before reading the 10th canto. But it makes sense that you read the first canto of a book and the second canto, the third canto, and so forth, and do it in order. That said, in contrast to those founding acharyas of the Sampradaya, Prabhupada, the founding acharya of ISKCON, he did emphasize, and that's what you referred to repeatedly, the necessity to read the first 9 cantos before reading the 10th canto. But he himself published a commentary on really a prose rendering of the 10th canto with his own commentary interwoven into it. and it originally came out in 2 volumes. We used to call it the Krishna book. And it's the first book I read, the Krishna book. When before I was initiated, I had acquired a copy of the Krishna book, and I used to read it. And whoever was around me, I would lecture. Love to hear those lectures now. That was like 1971, 1972, probably early 1972. And so he published that prior to publishing. I believe he was working. He had already written his commentary on the first canto and probably some other cantos as well. I'm not sure. Historically, I can't remember if the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust had published his translation of any earlier cantos before the Krishna book, but at any rate, long before he finished his commentary on the Bhagavatam, which did take him up into the 13th, I think, chapter, 12th or 13th chapter of the 10th canto. Long before that was done, the Krishna book was published and widely circulated. Prabhupada was asked about that once, that you said we should read the first 9 cantos, but you've given the 10th canto. And I believe he said something to the effect that you have to give a little taste of what it's all about, so to speak, to get people interested in the first place. But his emphasis was, I believe, that it's important to understand the underlying tattva, the philosophy, because in a broad sense, without understanding that, then the story of Krishna, his life, if you will, his prakat lila, the manifest lila in the 10th canto, if you were just to isolate that and take that out without any commentary, then it could be easily misunderstood. If you don't understand the underlying tattva, what we're talking about, philosophically speaking, when we speak of Krishna, it may sound perhaps like a story of young adolescents romanticizing and so forth in ways that would be appropriate, adulterous activity, even, at least with regard to the acme, the zenith of the 10th canto, which is the 5 chapters dealing with Krishna's Rasa Lila. The book, the 10th canto book, leads up to that. And there's a couple of aftermath chapters, if you will, before Krishna proceeds to Mathura and Dwarka, which, properly understood, are reflecting back on Braj, the Leela there. But the 5 chapters on of Krishna's Rasa Leela, and there's maybe 3 chapters, or there are several chapters, I should say, that precede that are centered on Sakya Rasa, and then there's 3 or 4 chapters that precede that are centered on Vatsalya Rasa. And these chapters really bring out those sentiments with a view to attract listeners to those sentiments, and thereby gain access into the service within the Leela. But that's the highest ideal, the prayojan, the goal, and so forth. And so he wanted that the public and his students will understand the entire body of the book, not just take the head and cut off the body. And I think that he was rightfully cautious, but the question that you have and the way that you reacted to reading my book, Aesthetic Vedanta, demonstrates that that caution was taken to an extreme on the part of listeners without balance. To give another example, Prabhupada would caution about focusing on the Gopi Lila, but he received some comments, perhaps in the mail or from some of his students in discussing with them, that made him reply, and I don't forget exactly what they were, but made him reply, it's not that gopis are bad. It's not a bad thing. So the fact that they would speak about it or write about it in such a way that it sounded like thought it was a bad thing, he had to make that corrective comment. And of course, whenever an acharya speaks, then the points that he makes are going to be most pertinent to the time and circumstances in which he or she is presently preaching. And many factors will come into play over time when that present acharya becomes a purvacharya or a previous acharya. So Prabhupada is now a purvacharya, a previous acharya. And so while his work is relevant for all times, it's most relevant for the time in which he was writing and speaking and setting an example. And some of the things that he said would be almost exclusively pertinent to that time and not pertinent in new times and new circumstances and so forth. So the times, for example, were that in the Western countries where he made his focus, this was an entirely new thing. For the most part, even in the academic community, if you were to learn about Hinduism in school, you learn about the caste system and Advaita Vedanta. No other forms of Vedanta, although there are 4 other forms of Vedanta, they're theistic and are thereby the majority, perspective on what the Vedic literature is about, that it's theistic rather than monistic in the case of Adi Shankar's Advaita Vedanta. So that just gives you some idea now what it was like, and also I think that the majority of the people that Prabhupada was attracting had come from a background that involved foregoing certain moral sensibilities in a free love, type of alternative culture. And so comparatively, things are quite different now. A young man like yourself comes in touch with the Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and there's not just one mission. There are many missions, or a number of them, I should say. There's not just one guru, there are a number of gurus. And there is much more information about all that Gaudiya Vaishnavism is as a religious group. not only in the international world, but in what it is in India, what it has been, what its history is, and so forth. Prabhupada gave us an overview, of many things. His campaign was very wide, very broad. And so when you're doing that, then you can't focus as much on depth or going into depth in any particular issue, or you're going to choose, I should say, certain issues to go into depth on that you think are very pertinent and important in the time and the circumstances that you find yourself, that the Acharya finds himself or herself. So it's very different now. And so that has to be taken into consideration. But I think the overall point of Prabhupada's obviously holds, that it's important to understand, imbibe, digest the underlying philosophy and theology that Leela narratives, by which I should say Leela narratives will be properly understood, to be more, for example, than just an imaginary story that has moral content or spiritual lessons in it, that it's an ontological reality and why it is, why it's a necessity, and so forth, for the ultimate reality to play out itself out in that way, and so on and so forth. So that's important for us to understand the Leela property, to take advantage of Leela narratives, and enter into them from aesthetic point of view. What content is there, and so on and so forth. To be acquainted with rasa tattva, the underlying tattva of the aesthetic, sacred aesthetic rapture, rasa. So the point is well taken, but it's the way in which Prabhupada emphasized it in the time. It was more pertinent to the time than it is now in these times. So, and for that matter, even the formal institution of Prabhupada's, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which tends to be conservative and insular, has members of that society publishing, for example, the commentaries of other previous acharyas, the founding acharyas, commentaries of Jiva Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, later commentary that's quite widely read and accepted, that of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and there are other institutions, Gaudiya institutions, also publishing such literature. It just wasn't available at the time. So it's a very different climate, very different circumstances, and much has been said about the 10th canto and explained about it and so forth. So I think the caution of Prabhupada has to be looked at in light of the times and circumstance. So when you're listening to me and you ask questions regularly, you hear and so forth. So I think you will not run into the kind of problems that Prabhupada was concerned about if you read the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam. It'll do you good.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Hare Krishna.
Where are you going? You're at the airport. Where are you going?
I'm going back to San Francisco. I was just visiting Aradhana and Gaur Narayan and other devotees in Asheville recently.
That's nice.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep. Hare Krishna.
Another
So
question?
just an update. We now have 6 more questions. So just,
Okay.
so Subal, you need to unmute yourself or get on the call somehow.
Dhanavat Skamarash.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good to see you. My question is, we've been having some local discussions here amongst ourselves about the idea that faith in general starts as laukika sraddha, and then it naturally progresses into sastriya sraddha. So 2 things. One is, what's the healthiest way for us as individuals to go through that transition, so that we stay balanced and we don't upset the other folks as we go through that, but also how we can have discussions in mixed audiences in such a way that we encourage others to healthily transition, and encourage others to also take advantage of all of our acharyas and our body of literature.
Well, laukika shraddha means ordinary shraddha, ordinary faith. That's not necessarily grounded in the scriptural discourse and argument and exclamation and explanations and so forth. And Shastriya Shraddha is, by contrast, that faith that's derived from scriptural argument and explanations and so forth. I think that was the first part of your question, how to move from the former to the latter?
Yes, how to healthily transition ourselves from one to the other.
Well, I think that we do that naturally because we in our sessions, sanghas and so forth, the discussion is from scripture. And I think that, I think that I would say in general, an important thing, and Prabhupada did this, was to emphasize the scripture. What is the scripture? What is the value of it? What is the whole idea of revelation? The broad idea of revelation. It's not just a dusty old book on a shelf, but you have to understand the argument of revelation that if the absolute infinite wants the finite to know about itself, then the finite can know, otherwise not. How can the finite digest the infinite? Well, it has to come from the infinite. The infinite can make that which was otherwise impossible possible. So revelation is the Godhead, so to speak, reaching out to us and explaining himself to us and so forth. So it's important in a broad sense to emphasize and understand the argument as to and for the necessity of revelation. And then there's an argument within that as to the specific texts, like the Bhagavatam, for example, that we give primacy to in terms of revelation, as per the Prameya Tattva of Tattva Sandarbha, where Rupa Goswami goes through a very well-reasoned explanation of the importance of Srimad Bhagavatam with regard to the entire corpus of Eastern revelation. And then there's a discussion to compare the Eastern revelation with the Western revelation idea, and so on and so forth. And so you can create faith in Shastra itself, which is perhaps the first step to take outside of what's in the Shastra. What is the Shastra? And Prabhupada did that by repeatedly. One of his favorite analogies was to compare the Shastra to the law books. Of course, I like to take that analogy and develop it, because it could be understood. So, okay, here's the law books. There it's done. It's in the law book. But the law books, of course, they help us to determine the law in an ongoing sense going forward as new circumstances arise. If the law book says to kill is a crime, but then someone kills accidentally, now you have to think about that. And a new law is going to be written as well. But at any rate, I've explained that many times, kind of a dynamic way of looking at what Prabhupada said. But it's one of the ways in which he emphasized the importance of revelation itself. And then within it, that, as I say, the particular texts that we emphasize and why. Those types of arguments and discussions about that, they will create faith in Shastra itself. If you look at the entirety of the Eastern Revelation, then you find the larger section, as Krishna explains in the Gita of Revelation, deals with subjects within the modes of nature and a license, if you will, to acquire. We are driven by our conditioning to be collectors, acquirers, because we feel there's something lacking in ourselves and we can add things on and be more complete. So we want to take, if you will, from the environment, but as much as you take, as much as you owe, if not more. But there's a way to take with a license, so to speak. So that's the whole karma kanda section, the pravritti marg, the karma marg, and that whole section of the sacred texts, properly understood, is an effort to awaken faith in Shastra, period, such that we'll be compelled to look further into it and beyond this larger section of pravritti marg, of material acquisition, to renunciation, and then further to a transcendental kind of acquisition, if you will, in terms of seva on the other side. So that looks like karma, but is entirely different, because one passes through giving up the exploitation and the renunciation of that, and not taking, one passes through in order to enter into loving. So that, what I mean by that is that the karma kanda section says, okay, if you want to take this, you have to do that, and that is the sacrifice. If you want to get this, you have to sacrifice in that way. If you want to do this, you have to put this aside and that aside, and then do this at this time, and so forth. So what's being, emphasized there, if one pays attention, which one should, Atato Dharma Jignasu says, for humans, now's the time to inquire about Dharma. What is Dharma? And so paying attention to that, one starts to figure out what's really being emphasized is not the thing that I want. That's my focus. What's being emphasized is the means to get there consistently is the same. The things may be different that I want. I may want a wife, I may want a husband, I may want a son, a daughter, I may want money, land, cows, as may be the case. But the way to get there consistently is through sacrifice, some kind of sacrifice. So sacrifice is the way to progress, giving up, letting go. Giving, if you will, is the receiving. So if you do the sacrifice right, you get the things. So when you get the things, you get faith in the scripture. So then you look carefully at it, then you start to realize this point I'm making. What's really talking about here is that I thought the getting was the thing I wanted, but the real getting is in the giving. How can I give more? And so forth. And that takes us then to the sections of the text that the sacred revelation, Shastra, that speaks about renunciation, less is more, and so forth. So from dharma jignasu, inquiry about religious life and a license to take, to live in this world bountifully, to Brahma jignasu, what is the nature of Brahman? He's more than someone just gives me things. He's got, and then rasa jignasu further. So the point I'm making here is that in order to have shastriya shraddha, how can we grow that? One of the principal ways is to emphasize what is the shastra, what is the importance of that, what is this body of literature, how it's pertinent in terms of what it's discussing in today's world, and so forth. But we do that in the gatherings that you have there that you mentioned. I'm sure that the discussion is based on the texts and so forth. But when you have, and so you're growing shastriya shraddha, but you have a mixed audience. I think that's the second part of your question. And I should say that, again, faith in Shastra is something to the effect also that we come to understand that there are certain things, we learn this from Shastra, that we can't understand. The Shastra tends to put our intelligence in its place. It has a place, but it doesn't have the highest place in terms of being a vehicle for knowing, arriving at comprehensive knowing. It doesn't. It very much taxes our intellect, and at the same time, let's the intellect know that it's not what it thinks it is, or it's not what we think it is. It has a place. It has an important place, but unto itself, it's exercising it is not going to bring us to comprehensive knowledge by which we can become fully satisfied and sense that there's nothing more that needs to be known. So anyway, in your gatherings, yes, you may have mixed groups, so it may be wise, for example, if you're going to discuss a topic from the scripture, to give some preface to that as to what the text is, why we're hearing from it. There's sometimes in formal Bhagavad settings, you find certain verses are cited prior to reciting the Bhagavatam, giving deference to Vyasa, to Narada, and Saraswati, as may be the case, and so on and so forth. So there may be some way of incorporating within that some preface to the discussion, especially when the group is mixed, that lays emphasis on the texts themselves. And I think that is how we grow Shastriya Shraddha, to explain what Shastra is. And that has to be, it requires some insight to give a dynamic explanation so that it becomes, as they say, alive and, understood as the God in reaching out to us and affirming to us with Om Pranam Omkar. What you want, you can have, but you're looking in the wrong place. And here's thousands of verses as to how that's the case and what's the place to look in and so forth. So that's a big discussion, big argument. But to grow faith in God that is derived from Shastra, I think is required to emphasize what the Shastra is. Hope that helps.
Okay. Roger, wait, we have a first question from the Spanish side. Padmanabha Swami, you want to ask your first question?
Yes. So the question is, with regard to something that I mentioned earlier, that there are 5 angas of bhakti that have been underscored by Rupa Goswami at the end of his discourse on sadhana bhakti. And one of those is living in Mathura. So the question is, why Rupa Goswami spoke about living in Mathura instead of living in Vrindavan? What's to be taken from that? There's not much to be taken from that. What he's speaking about there is the Mathura Mandal, in which Braj is included. He's not really speaking about the Mathura Leelas, the killing of Kamsa and those Leelas that involve Krishna's having departed, at least apparently, from Vrindavan, but about Vrindavan itself. So still, the Braj region, I should say, is sometimes referred to as the Mathura Mandal. There's the Mathura Mahatmya of I think the Padma Purana, speaking about the glories of living in the Mathura district. So Braj is in the district of Mathura. It's like in the city of, somewhere, a major city, San Francisco, there are suburbs of San Francisco. So, and there may be an urban area, or a suburban and rural, and the urban area, the suburban area, and then a rural area that all may be within the district of San Francisco. So it's the district of Mathura, and Braj is part of that. So it's just a way of referring to Braj. But yes, his emphasis is on living in Vrindavan. He lived in Vrindavan. The emphasis is also explained such that if you cannot physically live there, that you should live there mentally. If you do physically live there, you should also live there mentally. You should, to actually live there is to live there mentally. To live there with the mindset of the Brajbasis. You could live in Braj, but not live in the mindset. And you could live not physically in Braj, but live in the mindset and be more in Vrindavan than those living there physically. So living there physically, the emphasis on that is that it will promote living there mentally more so than another physical location. But the objective is to live there mentally, if you will, in the mindset of the Brajbasis. So there's 2 ways of observing that anga: to live there physically, and if you can't do that, to live there mentally. But in each case, the goal is to live there mentally. Just easier, perhaps, to do that when living there. Now that might be debatable. Depends who you are, and how overridden, if you will, places like the Dhams can become over time by the influence of time and so forth. Sometimes they shine more brightly because of sadhus bringing out their greatness, and sometimes they recede and so forth, just like the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had been, in an estimate of Bhakti note, had been lost, and he recovered it and so forth. So next question.
Okay, there was a comment that it is like Nadia district, I think. So the same. Okay. Rajabhumi, can unmute yourself, ask your question.
Hello.
One.
So children around the world are usually naturally, they like Krishna. And usually that holds throughout their childhood. They have that feeling of sentimental intrigue and attachment. And then when they reach a more discerning age where it would be time for them to contemplate the philosophy more and the esoteric nature of the scriptures, they there's often a sort of inner battle they go through because of cultural contrasts, like you know, in the West, it's a lot of the Western cultures are very anti-tradition these days, and so they kind of look at religion as just this old archaic thing that is not useful anymore, and it's even an exploitive, harmful thing. And so it's really hard for parents, devotee parents, sometimes to know how to guide their children through that phase and keep them still within, even remotely interested, basically. And I know somebody else has asked you about this previously, but I, for some reason, can't remember what you said. But what kind of advice would you have for parents who are wanting to keep their children's interest in pursuing spirituality?
Right. I think that the most important thing his question is that young children, oftentimes in Vaishnava families around the world, where Gaudiya Vaishnavism has been disseminated, they develop affinity for Krishna as children, and they like Krishna, and so on and so forth. But then when they start to become mature, and their reasoning faculty comes to bear, then the cultures that they live in don't support overtly, and may even be opposed to religious ideas and so on and so forth. And so there's this struggle, and it becomes difficult for the parents to bring the child up with a Krishna conscious perspective. And so is there any advice that I could give to parents? Or could I comment on that in general? That seems to be the question. Well, I think that in answering that, the first thing, of course, is that the children will be most impressed when that which they are taught is also exemplified by those who teach it. And when there is a contrast between what one is teaching or speaking about and what one is doing, the children are quick to pick up on that, the hypocrisy of that. So it's incumbent upon the parents who want to teach children, Vaishnava parents who want to teach their children Vaishnavism, to apply themselves in Vaishnavism in a way that's exemplary for a householder. And that should provide an example that's very endearing and has greater strength and power, and more, it provides more long-lasting impressions than impressions that they gather from school or from their iPhone or whatever, the internet and other exposure to other ideas. It would be difficult for them not to sort through those ideas, and I think they should have the facility to do so to some extent, rather than just being bound by a chastity belt, if you will, or something like that forcibly. But the home life is very nurturing and powerful, and so I think that the impressions that can be gained from that that type of environment that I'm speaking about that parents should provide will be longer lasting and will outweigh other influences over time, even if those other influences take precedence for some time. That said, of course, it's also important to be able to teach or to expose the children to teachings or explanations of Vaishnavism that take into consideration the worldly influences that those children are being confronted by, and give a thoughtful and insightful perspective as to the relevance of the teaching in relation to the modern world. Someone asked me the other day, how do you live in a modern world given an ancient identification with an ancient tradition? Well, first of all, the question is, how much do you want to live in the modern world? Is that necessarily the most advantageous thing for you as a human being and all of its implications? A transcendentalist has, a broader perspective that modern or ancient, the world is in many respects the same. And with the broadest brush, but importantly, it's, it's here today, it's gone tomorrow, and here we go, down the line into the basic tenets of Vedanta. So to be grounded in that is very important. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a young man. Of course, he was 24 years old, but he took sannyasa. Sarvabhauma thought, how will he be able to maintain this because of the influence of the world and so forth, even from a religious point of view, to remain as a sannyasi rather than as a householder. And he thought to ground him in Vedanta philosophy. So if they get exposure to, they get the opportunity to be exposed, which is inevitable, to modern thoughts and conceptions, and then they get to discuss them with their parents, or their parents introduce them to persons who they can discuss them with, who can reply from a Vaishnav perspective, then that will certainly help them to have a rational understanding of the early sentimental and laukic ordinary faith, rather than have well-reasoned faith in Vaishnavism. That's how our faith becomes strong. I've often given the example, if you take steel and you want to make it stronger, what do? You put it in a fire, which sounds contradictory, because in the fire it will melt, but you bring it out just at the point before it melts. And then in a cooler temperature, it hardens it, and then you stick it back in and so forth. So in order for faith to become well-grounded in Shastra and Shastra Yukti, scriptural reasoning and so forth, well, we have to look at other traditions, other ways of thinking from that vantage point and so forth, and be able to respond to it and so on. And many adults need that as well. What to speak of the children. But there are very, very powerful, compelling, and good arguments from a philosophical point of view, from a theological point of view, from a sociological point of view, from a psychological point of view, from a physical point of view, how advocacies within our Gaudiya tradition are relevant in the world today. And so you need to go, if you want to talk about it from a philosophical point of view, how our teaching is relevant. Well, we could go on for hours. If you want that from a theological point of view, from a philosophical point of view, what are we? Do you have a mind, or is there just a brain? Is there meaning to life? Does life have a purpose, an overarching purpose, or is it just meaningless? and whatever meaning we make up is the meaning. That's materialism. That's the dominant philosophical perspective. So if you can go deeply into that issue, you can really ground a young person or any person in basic tenets of Vaishnavism, and help that person to feel confident that their perspective is reasonable. That's what you're talking about. Is my faith reasonable? Or is that just a story that my parents told me and they don't do it either, and it doesn't make any sense? It's kind of a cartoon. Krishna, had a doll of Krishna, but I don't want to play with dolls my whole life. I'm an adult now, kind of a thing. So to strengthen the faith, the heart with the head. As I often say, use the head to strengthen, but also soften your heart. The heart is soft. When the heart is soft, it's strong. When it's softened by the head, then it becomes very strong. And if you don't use your head to soften the heart in the way I'm talking, then the heart becomes hard. Then even you have religious expressions that are very hard-hearted. They lack compassion and are narrow-minded and so on and so forth. So anyway, there's philosophical. Then from a theological point of view, is it relevant? Well, I mean, is Christianity relevant? For a lot of people, it's not, but for plenty of people, it is also. One person, Jesus, did one miracle. Well, and there were 12 witnesses, or half a dozen, or something like that. Well, our Eastern Savior Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did many miracles, and had hundreds and thousands of witnesses, and many biographies about him, and so that history should be made known. And then what's the underlying philosophy? When you look at Gaudiya Vaishnavism, compared to, theologically speaking now, compared to other religious traditions like the Western traditions, let's say, like Christianity, there's no explanation to Christianity. What is the world? What is matter? There's no explanation within Christianity of that. Gaudiya Vaishnavism includes not only what's out there, but more importantly, who's asking the question. And that's what life's about. What's out there? And who's asking the question? So it addresses from both sides. So from a theological point of view, you can point out the relevance and its power comparatively, from a sociological point of view, you can discuss it. I don't have the time to go into that, psychological perspective and so forth. So if you give me the time, I could go through all of these things and show, make a case for the relevance of the Vaishnava perspective. So they need to hear that. Parents need to hear that. It's not an easy thing. I mean, everyone has to grow up and make a decision what they're going to do in life, and what's hopefully they're going to decide what's rational. Many people don't even bother with what's rational. They just follow their feelings, and they're just driven by their senses. And a rational person, parents or elders, whomever, have to point out the shortcomings of being an animal when in human dress. Just pursuing the senses. Are they yours to do whatever you want? Can you see without the sun? Shouldn't you have some gratitude for the sun? Does that make sense? Does this make sense before the sun? You can't see without it. And so on. I mean, there's so many ways to bring us as humans through Vaishnavism closer in touch with nature, for what it is, in such a way that nature will also be inclined to help us to understand that she has a soul and it's us, and so on. So it's a good philosophy is required, and good example. Even if we're lacking philosophically as parents, our example, if it's a living example of real Vaishnava progress, can't be just a living example of some fanatical practice that's not well thought up and isn't showing up. in terms of compassion, kindness to others, broad-mindedness. Vaishnavas should be very broad-minded, should be able to discuss different issues, not an example of hiding from other books and just calling other traditions names. And so that's not going to be, even if you're strict in your chanting, but that's what's coming out of it. You're doing something wrong, and your example is not going to be compelling. So I'll stop there with that, and we'll see if we can answer some of the other questions that are a little more quickly.
Okay. The last questions are all from the Spanish side. So,
Yeah.
Maharaj.
So for our listeners, Padmanabh Maharaj is explaining the question in Spanish first, which some of you can't hear. He'll now speak it to me, and then I'll repeat it. The question is that how to intensify one's practice, one's sadhana, when it's not intense. He says, for example, he wants to chant 16 rounds, but he can't. And the world comes on every morning and takes over his life and so forth. So given that situation, how can he intensify his sadhana? Well, I think that you have to adopt a sadhana that you can practice every day. So if you find you're not able to chant 16 rounds, then you chant 8 rounds every day and do it at the same time every day, and in conjunction with other practices you may have, reading and so forth, and in a concentrated way, without distractions, with an effort to pratyahara, to push out other thoughts and so forth, close the door and practice a lot, some time, for that, wherein the practice is not distracted. If you're trying to chant 16 rounds, but you get to 8, 9, and your mind's going to, I got to get to work, I got to do this, I'm going to be doing that, then, cut it off and chant less, but concentrate it. That's what I would suggest. Another question. Another Spanish question. Maharaj will read it to the Spanish-speaking devotees. Then he'll repeat it to me, and I'll repeat it for those who are, I guess, listening on Facebook. The question is, what makes Krishna the maximum authority, the supreme authority? That's a question that could obviously lend to a lot of discussion and a long answer. I'll give you a short answer. Within the Hindu pantheon of gods and goddesses, and beyond that, cross-culturally to different religious traditions, we can make a comparative study. If we look at Christianity, we find the position of Christ is thought to be supreme. But Christ is the sacrificer, and Krishna is the enjoyer. Krishna is depicted as the enjoyer. So the sacrifices that Christ is making is for someone, and that someone is supreme. He may be one with that Father, if you will, in some respect, as we think of it, in one and different. But if there's to be a sacrificer whom we think has made the supreme sacrifice, as I think it's thought of Jesus in Christianity, we have to understand that he's sacrificing for someone. So who is the someone? What do we know about that someone? Not very much. In Krishna consciousness, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there's, in all forms of Vaishnavism, there's emphasis on the enjoyer, Narayan, in his different forms and so forth. And he's differentiated Narayan from Shiva, who's also doing tapas, meditating to attain something. Narayan's not, in all of his forms, is not trying to attain anything. All the expressions of Narayan, of himself, are not trying to attain anything. So the description of the Godhead within Vaishnavism is very compelling in terms of speaking about the center, the ultimate taker, the enjoyer, who, because he is the center, can take in such a way that that energy can then be redistributed back to everyone. So when we come then within Vaishnavism, I'm just speaking quickly here, briefly, but brought it from Narayan to Krishna, what do we find? I mean, Krishna wields in Braj, in Vrindavan, wields no weapon. He only plays. That's all he does. He's only playing. His weapon is a flute. He's only playing. So when, in order to play, you have to have some power. So for example, if you want to take a vacation and play, you have to have some power with the company. They will give you time off. You have to have some power in the bank in terms of money that you saved to spend on the vacation. So to play requires power. So one who is only playing, and that is Krishna. The term Leela means to play in a broad sense, and it most applies by far more than anywhere else to Krishna in Vrindavan. Krishna in Mathura, Krishna in Dwarka is not playing to the same extent as he is in Vrindavan. So the form of the Godhead within Hinduism, cross-culturally, you look at it. Who is the most powerful should be the one who has nothing else to accomplish, who's fully accomplished, and therefore his movements will only be out of being accomplished, play. Not that he has to attain anything. There may be something to be attained within the play. Krishna wants to attain Radha's attention within the play, but that's all play. Krishna's not lacking anything. He's only playing. Within the context of the play, there's something to attain only. So the Buddha had to attain something. He had to attain Buddhahood. Who else we got? Jesus, Muhammad. In Islam, he's certainly not an example of the Supreme himself. He's speaking about the Supreme, but in his very broad and vague way. So we get some specifics within Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and that voice from transcendence, that voice from revelation, objectively speaking, if you can determine that what's being spoken about here is something that has spiritual credibility, Krishna Lila, because of the philosophy that underlies it, theology that underlies it, and so forth, which is considerable, it has to be taken seriously. Then that the voice about that is the most complete voice about the nature of the absolute, the nature of the Godhead that it's available on earth. Oftentimes, again, in contrast to Christianity, it's like God has no face. You don't know anything about him. Vaishnavism specializes in this discussion as to the nature of transcendence, the nature of transcendence, the nature of the Godhead. And in the literature about Krishna, it becomes very specific. And in the broad sense, again, here is a fully accomplished being. that didn't need to do anything to become accomplished. You could say, well, the Buddha is accomplished, but he had to do something to be accomplished to the extent that he is. So that's my thoughts on that. Bhagavan Shri Krishna Ki Jai. So is that it, or is another question?
There is one more.
Should we try to? One more in Spanish. We're only 8 minutes over, 9 minutes over. We'll try to take it.
Okay.
It's a long one.
It's what?
So the question is about the Bhagavad-gita, second chapter, verse 14, where Krishna extols the virtues of tolerance. There he says, happiness, distress, good, bad, hot and cold. These are all products of the senses and the mind, and one should tolerate. So the question is, well, how do I tolerate? Why do I have to tolerate happiness? I want happiness. I want happiness for my friends and so forth. Well, what Krishna is saying there is that happiness and sadness, good and bad, hot and cold, all of these are perceptions that arise in the mind, and they're not what they appear to be. And so we shouldn't run after material happiness or run away from material distress. We should understand them to just be perceptions of the mind, and they're not what they appear to be. And rather than being driven, as I say, by disappointments in life, the sadness, or driven by the happiness, you should step back and see them for what they are and ground oneself beyond the dualities of the appearance of happiness, the appearance of distress, because as Krishna explains later in the Gita, material happiness is the beginning of material distress. Let's say, for example, we want material happiness for our friends or ourselves, but as much as that involves acquiring something, it involves losing something. So if I want my daughter to be happy by getting a good husband, reasonable desire, we have to also understand in a larger sense that she'll become attached to her husband, and her husband will leave her either by death or he's a good husband, only by death. And so the attachment that was now bringing her happiness, because that object is now gone from her life, will bring her distress. So happiness and distress, these are two illusory perceptions. You look at the other side of the coin, and happiness is distress. Obviously, I'm giving a broader Vedantic picture. Relatively speaking, sure, we want people to be happy. We want ourselves to be happy, but we should be careful about being overwhelmed by the happiness that we achieve, or driven by the pursuit of that happiness unto itself, because it's not what it appears to be, and it falls short in the ultimum. Therefore, there's a deeper happiness, a more rewarding and enduring happiness that lies beyond the happiness and the distress that comes from sense perception and the mind. I mean, is it really happy In your mind, it's happy. In my mind, it may be unhappy. The very same thing. So which is that happiness? You say an object is a cause for happiness. I say the same object is a cause for distress. What will the third person say in between? Well, maybe one, maybe part-time, one. So which is it? The point is, it's an illusion. So we should not live our life driven for the pursuit of material happiness, nor running away from material sadness. Obviously, within moderation, in a broader sense, we want a material well-being for everyone, and within the context of that, the pursuit of transcendental happiness. We want a kind of a horizontal, foundation of our material life that's wholesome and happy, relatively speaking, so that we can, rather than chase after those things, use the better part of our energy to pursue vertical growth, spiritual growth, where we can find enduring happiness. Sometimes people ask, why is it that good people who follow Dharma are met with so much misfortune? Well, the question presumes that the result of Dharma should be material happiness, but that's not the result of Dharma, ultimately. The fruit of living a dharmic life, in the full sense of the term, can't be material happiness. If it is, then it's not worth the effort. You can acquire things without being dharmic in this life. You can steal things. Or there may be other ways. So the fruit of a dharmic, appropriate, proper life is not material happiness per se, and therefore, to underscore that, often persons who are living a dharmic life get opposite results, like the Pandavas, material distress, which underscores and emphasizes for them the nature of the world. Because in an overarching sense, the world is actually a place of suffering that we're trying to get out of. When we mitigate this suffering temporarily by some material happiness, we think we've succeeded, but it doesn't go away. It keeps eating at us. We're struggling then to overcome the inevitability of our own demise. I'm living on death row. So today they brought me a pizza, great, I'm living on death row. Okay. So death row means it's an English thing. I'm living in the prison and I'm sentenced to die. So my happiness is today I got a cigarette, whatever they give them, but if you look at the bigger picture, well, it's not a very happy situation. That is the transcendentalist perspective on the world. So they don't put as much stock in material happiness unto itself, within reason, right? But these things should be tolerated. It means we shouldn't be intoxicated by our material gains and think everything's great. Bhaktivinoda said, I curse good health because in good health, I think I'm all right, and I'm not. Now, that's a strong statement by someone in Bhava. We should pursue good health within reason, but we should have to live inside the larger picture also, so that we don't become intoxicated by the pursuit of material happiness and just bounce back and forth between avoiding distress and getting happiness, going to heaven, going to hell, lifetime after lifetime in a broader picture to end the whole thing. That is what we want. That's what you can do. Taravali Saki Ki Jai. Okay. Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Gaur Bhakta Hari Hari.
Thank you so much, Guru Maharaj, for
Yeah,
spending time with us. And
Yep.
um,
Okay.
every devotee can, the other devotees can stay on just for a minute for announcements. Okay, so I want to also thank Pamanava Swami and Guru Vakya for their translating. It's a wonderful service and we all appreciate it very much. Just want to remind the devotees that every day of the week now we have classes. And we're going to have some new classes for July. So I'm going to let you know what they are. But we have 3 more days left or we have 3 days left in June. So Monday we have continued Ramara Gita, Pamanava Swami. Tuesday we have Gaudiya Kirtans, Grasping the Essence of Devotional Hymns, Agni Dev Das. That'll be his last class. Wednesdays, we have Krishna Sangarbha with Dula Chandra. He'll be continuing next month. Thursdays, I'm doing interviews with modern day sages, the beauty and messiness of the sadhaka's journey. We will be continuing that into July. And then Friday and Saturday, the devotees who had been giving classes they're done with their series. So this coming Friday, we have a new presenter. We have Krishna Chaitanya Das. He's giving a talk on Dasya, Sakya, Vaidhi, Rag. What? So what? Now what? It's such a Krishna Chaitanya title. And then on Saturday, we have Atulananda Swami is going to be joining us in the month of July for teaching the qualities of bhakti. And then on Sundays are question and answers. So, and also then on Tuesdays, because this will be the last Tuesday that, let's see, it's going to be, what's happening on Tuesdays? Oh, okay. Ashram Maharaj is going to be teaching another class on the 4 Vaishnava Sampradayas, a brief introduction to the schools of bhakti. So really want to thank all the devotees that are participating, giving these classes, and also to Padmanabha Swami again, because there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes of trying to organize these classes and convince devotees to participate, because everybody's got some, a lot of devotees have some issues around speaking. So just so grateful that he's behind the scenes doing all of this, really trying to bring us, our worldwide Sangha, together and in the best way possible. So very grateful for that. All right, my dear devotees, thank you so much for all your participation, and we'll be seeing everyone again soon. Hare Krishna.
Haribo.
Haribo Jai.